everybody. This is Robin with Bug Zapper Pest Control. I've got another long drive. So I'm heading north right now. I'm passing through Marcola with some horses. And I'm heading on up to the town of Sweet Home. I'm going to help a nice elderly gentleman with a flea problem he's having. So fleas are the worst. I don't like fleas. I treat them pretty regularly. I've got a really good track record of getting rid of them. They're not that difficult to get rid of as long as you're using the right product in the right quantity for the right kind of structure, and depending on where the fleas are. You know, you've got carpeting to deal with, there's furniture, and there are pets. Usually there are pets involved. So the problem with fleas, for instance, when I go out to a house, you might be wondering, you know, with something like fleas where, you know, you walk in, there's a mass emergence, and then suddenly you've got them all over you. How does a pest control guy keep from bringing those home with him at the end of the day? And the answer is diligence and being very, very careful. So far, I haven't brought anything home with me, but it is a constant worry. Not so much worried about roaches, but fleas and bed bugs, those are the two that I worry about. So with the job I'm going to here, you know, I got another long drive heading north. I thought I'd take this time to talk to you about fleas a little bit. Fleas, aside from being the worst, as I've already said, are a real nuisance. The most common ways people get fleas are via their pets. That's obviously the most common. You know, you've got a dog, you've got a cat. It can even happen with other animals, but usually it's a dog or a cat. They go to a dog park where a few fleas are nestled in a bush. They jump on the dog, you bring them home, and a month later you've got a flea problem. 2 months later you've got a pretty bad flea problem. It can get worse and worse over the years, especially. I've had a few customers that have let it go for upwards around a decade. And when you walk into a place like that, they're all over you, a human being, in an instant. There are human fleas, there are dog fleas, cat fleas. They're all somewhat the same in North America. We don't really get too many differences between the species until you start looking globally. There are thousands of types of flea species. They do very, very well, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about how they work. So fleas have a proboscis, which is sort of, we might call it a nose, but with fleas it's a little different. They basically have a syringe for a face. It's a long, pointed nozzle, kind of like a straw with a needle at the end, that they jab down into the skin of, you know, your faithful dog or cat, or you, even birds, rabbits, things like that. And they basically drink your blood through that. Adult fleas have to have a blood meal, is what it's called, in order to reproduce. If they don't get that blood meal, there is no next generation. No blood meal, no next generation. So it's really important for them to do that. You might think that having a syringe for a face is a particularly awful thing and would make life kind of difficult, but for a flea it works out really perfectly. They've been surviving for a very long time. In fact, we have records of them all the way back to the early Cretaceous, which means, you know, T-Rex was dealing with these things, and we're still dealing with them now. So they've lived a very long time and done extremely well for themselves by specializing in such a way that they can survive. There's also a couple other traits they use to survive very, very well in your home or even outside of your home. One of them is the fact that they go through a pupa stage. So fleas go through a complete metamorphosis, meaning they go from eggs. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae are quite different from the adults. They're worm-like and small. The larvae emerge into, they form a cocoon and they pupate. They become pupa inside this cocoon, and then from there they hatch out as adults. Now this pupa phase is one of the reasons fleas are still around. The pupa phase, they weave themselves into a cocoon, and that cocoon is extremely resilient and protects them from a lot of things. Extremely cold temperatures, heat, pesticides, which is why most modern pesticides don't do a whole lot against that pupal stage. They're like armored little tanks in there. And they're also spring-loaded in this cocoon with their legs bent back. Fleas have this tremendous jumping ability, of course. We'll get more on that in a second. So what happens is, even if you put down a layer of pesticide, you'll kill the adults, you'll kill the larvae, you know, done. You can kill all of that. The eggs don't do too well as long as you can find them, and they are notoriously difficult to find because they're small. But that pupal stage are pretty much immune to that section of treatment. So what happens is, you put down a single treatment, the pupae survive, they wait a while, the treatment wears off, eventually they get a triggering mechanism, they pop out, and they start feeding again. So this is the problem that a lot of do-it-yourselfers will have with fleas. You'll seem to have made a dent and gotten rid of them, but a month later they're back. And that's because that pupal stage is really difficult to get rid of. So a good pest control treatment will involve 2 treatments at least. Usually 2 is enough, and they'll be spaced far enough apart with some strong residual products in order to knock them out. Now let's get on to how this works, this function, this pupal function. So fleas, once they weave themselves in, are triggered. meaning they'll stay in that pupal stage until they become adults. Once they become adults, they don't leave. They'll stay in that cocoon stage, and they can stay in there for months. They can stay in for a really long time. They can survive winters. They can survive some pretty adverse conditions, pesticides, things like that. What you want is for them to leap out of that pupal stage, because they're spring-loaded in there. It's just like popcorn. They just pop out onto a host. And you want to trigger that, because once they're out of that pupal stage, and once they're adults, they're outside of the cocoon, then pesticides will kill them pretty quickly. And so you need to trigger that. Now, they're triggered by vibrations, prevalence of carbon dioxide, heat, even heavy sound, such that would be made by an animal or a person walking by the cocoon. It's very, very small, mind you. They're really difficult to find. So you want to trigger them. So a good treatment will involve treating to wipe out the larvae, the adults, the eggs, and then vacuuming, walking by, things like that to trigger that pupal stage into coming out, and then hitting them again. That usually wipes them out permanently, and you're done. Also, a good treatment will involve having your pets treated by veterinary-grade products. Because without that, there's no guarantee that you're not going to get fleas again 2-3 months down the road when your pets encounter other pets or go to the dog park or things like that. There's also a sneakier way that a lot of people don't know about that you can end up with fleas. Wild animals. So let's say you've got a porch or a deck in your backyard and some raccoons have been sleeping under there. It's really common. Rats, mice getting into the crawl space and living there. They might not be bothering you. You might not know they're there, but they're there, and they can bring in fleas. Well, those fleas will hover around the underside of the house, the deck, the porch, the brush, trying to reproduce to find other animals. And here comes your very meticulous and clean house cat that has never encountered fleas or other pets, just stays indoors mostly. They get on the cat, they go inside, and a month or two later, you've got a flea problem. When ordinarily you wouldn't, because you're very careful about that. So it can still happen. A good treatment will take those considerations into effect. So let's move on a little bit about the jumping, especially, because fleas are notorious for it. Fleas can jump about 7 inches up, adult fleas, and they only measure, about 1/8 of an inch at their largest. They can be substantially smaller than that. But fleas, adult fleas, can jump about 7 inches up, about 13 inches out, and any angle in between. They're very good at aiming. They have this jumping mechanism that actually cannot be explained by muscle systems. No normal animal muscle would be able to allow them to jump that high. It's actually similar to, the mantis shrimp has a punch that it does underground to attack its enemies that works kind of on a similar principle. Muscle alone wouldn't allow that to occur. So they have a whole different system. Fleas, it's rather like winding back a compound bow. They basically wind the muscle system back, they tighten it, they bend it back, almost like a pulley system, like a compound bow. It's actually a protein sheath that they build that does this. They wind it back, and then they lock it into place with this locking mechanism, which is another tendon they have. Once it's locked into place, they can exert more pressure on it, and it's kind of like winding a key up. They wind back that jump again and again until it's really strong, and then they lock it in by pulling this tendon back. And that way, they're just basically locked and loaded, ready to go. They can't actually control the jump very much, except for when it triggers. So what happens is they feel that vibration, they sense an animal nearby, they're ready to go, they aim at it, they unlock that mechanism, and it triggers, and they just, straight like an arrow, just right at their prey, their host. They're fairly flat on the sides, which allow them to expertly weave through hairs, your clothing, feathers, also for some that will roost on birds when they live there. Their larval stage is worm-like, very, very small, and very delicate. They do not have a proboscis. They cannot pierce the skin and drink, anything like that. They have a chewing mouth part, and they live on organic debris, like, human scalp, for instance, or skin cells, animal skin cells, things like that. They'll even, it's been known, they'll eat vegetable matter. Anything they can to stay alive. More notoriously, and cockroaches do this too, they will feast on the feces of the adults and get a little bit of dried blood that way. It's gross, but it actually is a really successful thing that a lot of insect species do that has kept them alive. I wouldn't be interested. I think human beings would find that revolting, but it works for the bugs, and there's a reason they've been around since the Cretaceous. Anyways, I thought I'd give you a little bit of information about, the problem with fleas, how they spread, how virulent they can be. They can spread disease. You've got a variety of diseases and viruses, bacteria that they can spread. The most notorious of those being the Black Death, bubonic plague, which they spread in conjunction with Rattus rattus, the roof rat or black rat. That happened several times over history and wiped out about 1/3 of Earth's population. It's a pretty serious problem. But, other than that, fleas themselves, they're a terrible nuisance. You want to get rid of them as soon as you can. And I thought I'd shed a little bit of light about why that's difficult, how they're so successful, how they get into your house, and just a little bit of information about this little pesky thing. Because doing so helps you go a long way in understanding the problem and also understanding how treatment works.